Epsinasi, welcome to another edition of Mawio'mi. I'm your host, Jim Richardson.
And I'm your co-host, Terry Richardson. Well, bro, we're lucky to have with us a couple of great individuals here.
Listen, the pulse of what's happening in New Brunswick sits right over there, as it relates to energy and economic development.
For sure.
We're in for a treat, bro.
But it's so important, right? And we said that when we came back on air. We've been off the air for quite a period of time, 8 months, until we got reorganized here. And thanks to Rogers for bringing us back online and allowing us this opportunity to film some episodes. We appreciate Rogers taking the time to come up and do this with us. And today we have with us Tom Mann and Norm Sawyer. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. Our pleasure.
Tom and Norm, maybe we'll start off by just giving us a little bit of your background, Tom, first, and then Norm.
Well, it depends on how far you want to go back.
I don't want to go back too far, Tom.
I'm a born and bred guy from Bathurst.
Yes, absolutely. He's a Bathurst boy.
And my dad operated Pepper's Drug Store on Main Street in Bathurst for over 35 years. And my career was beyond Bathurst High School, and spent a life in basically mediation and facilitation. I was a labor union negotiator for 30 years.
We'll get into that in a little bit.
And so that's who I am, and I've been doing work up here in the North Shore, helping to incite the economic development since about 2012.
Great. Norm?
Yeah, well, I'm born and raised in Rexton, and did most of my career, started my career in New Brunswick, but I was in Ontario for some bit and in the U.S. I was lucky enough to fall into the nuclear business at an early age. I ended up being licensed to operate the nuclear reactor at Point Lepreau. I then moved to Ottawa to be a regulator, so I spent a decade in the regulations for regulating nuclear in Canada. Then came back for a little bit, ended up going to Quebec. I was the station manager of the Hydro-Quebec Gentilly 2 plant for a number of years, and then went into the nuclear business on the private side with Bruce Power, the big machine in Ontario. When I was there, it was one of the largest sites in the world, so I was chief nuclear officer there. Spent some time in the U.S. with the World Association of Nuclear Operators, and then retired for the first time, as my lovely wife normally tells me. Went into consulting business, and I consult internationally now around the world on energy file, not just nuclear, but energy in general.
All that right out of Rexton.
Energy is so important, right? I mean, when we're looking at it, and that's why, gentlemen, really, we've got so much we really want to talk about. But why not start there with the energy file? I think that's a great place to start. So I know both of you are heavily involved in the energy sector. Norman, you in the nuclear, and Tom, you along with a lot of the wind proponents and solar proponents, and you do a lot of the consulting work, which we've had you do some work for us. We appreciate it. And, I think that when you're looking at it right now, one of the things that we really wanted to talk about, we're trying to get a feel for it, is you've probably heard NB Power is going through a analysis of what can be done. And I know that's, we've offline, we've often talked about that, what that analysis would look like and how we would move that, how the province would, react to how they would engage people. So I just wanted your guys' perception. The province has come out with a plan to have 3 independent individuals look at it, but an engagement process with the people of New Brunswick. Do you think it's time we've done that? Or, because, the Premier has made the statement, getting tired of kicking the can further down the road, which, I agree with in a sense. And I'm just wondering, what's your perception on that? Do you think it's something that could work, Norm, or not work?
Oh, I think so. Anytime you go out and talk to the public, you're going to, I've always said the answers are always in the bum in the seats. So you go talk to the people, they'll tell you what's going on. The energy file around the world, not just in New Brunswick, has changed over decades. And you have to be somewhat flexible in how you approach some of these challenges. I think it's time for New Brunswick to really reflect on whether the approach they have in place today is actually the best for the province. I know there's a lot of concern on cost of electricity. The cost is, and people ask me, well, if we do something, the costs will go down. So I don't want to throw any curveballs here, but I don't think the costs will go down. What you're trying to do is maintain at where you are today the best as you can. And I think it's really time to, as I mentioned, I think this is a great idea by Premier Holt to go out and say, let's ask the public what they believe. We went through this maybe a decade ago or so, maybe longer than that. It's been a long time.
Yeah.
It wasn't, the perception back then was we weren't asked. Well, this time we're going to ask, and which is really, really important. But I'd just like to highlight one point, though. I know there's been some troubles about people concerned about NB Power, and they seem to be taking it out on the staff, and it's not the staff.
Yeah.
I agree with you 100%.
That's
The people that climb those poles, you got to give them credit. The men and women that go up there in the middle of a snowstorm to make sure we have electricity
We
are
saw it.
not the problem.
we
right?
saw that this weekend.
Yeah.
You know,
Oh,
even
really?
in our community.
Yeah.
You know, with the powers down.
Yeah, it's just, it's not there. So, I think we need to make sure we all look at this in a reasonable and understandable way.
Yeah, and then I'll just pick up, Norm, on your point about asking the public. And it was actually 2010.
2010, there you go.
With the proposed sale of NB Power to Hydro-Quebec.
To Hydro-Quebec.
Hydro-Quebec.
And that was during the period of time just as Facebook was being introduced. And the public, at one point, that campaign, and I know it very well, that campaign had 50,000 Facebook people. We had to have 4 volunteer coordinators to manage the Facebook pages. And the issue of consultation, it wasn't even consultation, at that time, and I hope lessons have been learned.
Hopefully.
Since then, in 15 years, that the cabinet didn't even know until the Tuesday before the announcement of the deal. The backbenchers didn't know till Thursday before the deal was announced. So that was back in 2010, 2009, 2010. And, it really resonated with the, it's like what we're seeing today about Canada and the US and the pride that people had and the pride that people showed in NB Power. So your point, Norm, about, the employees, but, every ratepayer is very proud of their sovereignty around energy. And, the story back then, if you sell off NB Power to Hydro-Quebec at that time, what really do you have as a sovereign organization or a sovereign jurisdiction?
You raise a point when you mentioned that triggers me with respect to ratepayers, because one of the discussions, obviously, with NB Power is their debt. They've got, 5 billion, 6 billion in debt. Ratepayers now, it's on NB Power's books, but do we take it on into the taxpayers? In other words, it becomes a part of the government now. That seems to be a discussion that's going to be part of this whole focus as well.
I've thought of that, but the first step is you got to stop the bleeding, whatever that is, right?
Agreed.
Before
Absolutely.
I think phase 1 of this is to look at it really in a logical and non-emotional, approach, and say, what is the best approach to go forward with? Then you can start deciding who's going to pay. There's only 2 groups. It's either the ratepayer or the taxpayers, but you first have to, ground everything in place to make sure that whatever approach is going to be used is workable, and that you're sustaining the right reliability levels, so therefore your cost is being maintained at a reasonable level, right?
But would you agree, Norm, that the infrastructure is aging? That's a reality. You look
Point
at Mac to Quack Dam.
Yeah.
We've got Point Lepreau, which is a nuclear power station, but it's a one-off. So there's an advantage sometimes when you operate in a fleet mentality. And is there so the question is are we is the province open to somebody taking over NB Power? Is the province looking at maybe selling off some of the assets they have? These are questions that are going to be interesting to hear or what the plan is in the next little while.
But I would go back and say, let's ask the public what they think, right?
Yeah.
Because not to get into that, when you go back and look and think about what happened in 2010, was it really a bad idea that at the rate we were going? Like some people will go back and say, well, geez, maybe we should have did what we did, but. I think that's what you have to do. You really have to think this, and it's time to do that, right? There's been too much pushing forward. I got to give credit to Premier Holt. There's too much pushing forward. There's too much doing this and that. You got to stop and stabilize, and look at this correctly. And this review, it needs to be done in a way that you come up with some foundational, steps that you can move forward towards and finally, box this in so we have control of it.
So when you look at development obviously we need more energy in the province. We know that. If we're going to attract people here, we have to have energy in order for them to operate here.
Yeah.
So what is the solution? Like, how do we get to that energy goal that we need to reach to enable data centers to come here, to enable, big manufacturers to come here, because they need the power. And, it's nice to say renewables is part of the solution. I agree. But it doesn't give you that baseline source of energy. So where do we go from there?
It sounds like you're leading into Mr. Nuclear here.
Well, no, let me go a little step further. So, I've done some work internationally on grids and things like that. And what you see now is, that's what I was saying, that grids were looked at in a certain way in the old days. They were looking, what they used to do with like energy boards and things like that, would look asset by asset by asset. So let it be nuclear, wind, solar, and it would be, so then they compare one to the, what's going on today, and the more advanced decision-making process is you look at it as a grid as a whole. And what do you need? You need wind, you need solar, but you also need nuclear to support, you need that base load, whatever that is. And policy plays a big role in that, right? And you have to have the right policy in place to support it all. So you have a grid that's reasonable. And again, you're quite right. I think decisions are being made about New Brunswick now because of the electricity prices and the reliability of the grid, right? And they're not positive decisions, and that's terrible. We need to address that, right?
Well, Norm, one of the concerns I've got is, like you look at one of our major power sources is Point Lepreau. And what's happening down there? I mean, is it a maintenance issue? I mean, it seems to me nuclear is straightforward. You get the system up and running, and away you go.
Yeah. Well,
or is it more complex than that?
Yeah. Well, I guess it depends who you ask, but it's a little bit complex. You're quite right. I mean, if you look at, there's about I forget 9 or 10 of those similar units around the world that are operating. They operate all fairly well, but for whatever reason at Lepreau, like if you look at Lepreau from 80, whenever it started up, 81, 82, 83, to 93, 94, it was the top unit in the world. I mean, we're talking about the top unit ever. And then it went through a couple of cycles that it is struggling ever since that. Now, as the equipment gets older, you do have to deal with it. And when they did the refurbishment, they came out of refurbishment, but I think what was missing was the plan to work on the rest of the equipment, and that should have started, some years ago. It's all right to make, and if you look at all the refurbs in Canada and internationally, they do it in two pieces, actually 3 phases. First one is you look at, can you do it, and you get the money to do it. Phase 2 is all the engineering, and then they get into the construction piece, right? And then coming out of construction or just starting back up, you got to know you have to pay the bill, right? It's a mortgage you just took on.
Yeah.
So that unit has to operate very well going forward. So all that equipment that you didn't work on,
If it breaks down, it causes.
yeah, that's right. But you should have a plan to address it as you're going along. And I
Preventive
think
maintenance program.
well, something
Really
like
have
that. Yeah. So if you look at some of the equipment, like the major big transformers, some of them, if they were put in there in the 1980s, are getting up there in age. So there's a risk to the reliability of the unit based on some of that equipment. And that's the stuff that I think that, and I'm hoping that's what MB Power is working on, but that's the stuff they should be working on. So this whole, plan needs to be focused on, and that's how good plants run. At Bruce Power, they're exceptionally good at that. They really plan ahead. It's all private investment, and it's got to run well, and reliable, and safely, right? And
Keep that train of thought. We'll be right back after this segment.
Welcome back to Mawio'mi Gathering Place with our guests here, Tom Mann and Norm Sawyer. So Norm, we left off sort of talking about nuclear, but one thing that we wanted to touch on, the permitting phase of nuclear. A lot of people think that happens overnight, but it's quite a long process.
It is. It's very detailed. A lot of analysis that occurs. It can take anywhere from 3 to 5 years. There's, public intervention. There's a lot of conversation with First Nations to make sure that, rightly so, that needs to be done. So all that stuff takes time going forward. Including the research and, wherever the site is chosen, wherever that is, There's a lot of analysis. Is there earthquakes there? Is there any and what's happened on that site in the past? So all that analysis has to occur and has to be drawn up. If you're working already with a brown site or a nuclear site, it's a little bit different. It can be a little bit quicker, but it's still a lengthy process.
So that's a good segue into what you wanted to talk about, bro, in regards to First Nations consultation.
Yeah, well, Tom has been very active in the Aboriginal file, and I think he has a good history of what's happening, Tom. Over the last 10 years, I mean, you've seen a lot of changes in terms of the relationship with First Nations and the projects that we're involved in.
Well, absolutely, and I actually go back a little further than 10 years because, Chief, you and I met when you were a counselor
wow,
at
true.
Pabino.
Oh, I forgot about that. That was a while back.
And at Trafalgar
yes, with the training.
I was the deputy minister at post-secondary education, training, and labor, and recognized at that time through that government that more of the funding that was available for training in New Brunswick had to be dedicated to the First Nation communities and their advancement. And over that 4-year period, there was a couple of governments, and the policy and the reflection of the importance of the relationship with First Nations and Indigenous people generally changes by shade, right? Depending on who's in and what their priorities are, what their personal experiences, and I'm talking at the premiership level. And moving forward into 2016, I became engaged with the Beldoon Port Authority following my career with government, and recognizing then the initiating piece was the fact that the Port of Beldoon was facing a lawsuit in the court in Quebec and by the Mi'kmaq of Gaspé. And that was after the Mi'kmaq in New Brunswick had filed an application for incomplete or non-sufficient consultation, and it was ruled that there had been. So the process since 2016, based in around that file in the Port of Beldoon, was to create relationships, and there had been none, and there hadn't been any for hundreds of years, at least 50 years going back to the 1960s with the building of the smelter, the power plant, Brunswick Mines back in the 50s. And it was really starting from that piece. And it starts by, as you mentioned earlier, Norm, bums in the seat. Mm-hmm. You go and you talk to the people. Mm-hmm. And I remember the first meeting I was to was in Listugush. And a well-known counselor, still is, Wendell, sat to me and he said, imagine this. Imagine that you're in your backyard, it's a beautiful summer afternoon, and your neighbor's having a party and you're not invited. And you can smell the beef on the grill, you can hear the bottle caps opening, and you're not invited. And he said, and I looked at him and he said, first we have to be invited to the barbecue before we start talking about partnerships.
Yeah.
And it was so important, and I took from that the relationships are based on trust, and you can only go at the speed of that trust.
What I always say, Tom, is not so much the barbecue as the cups of tea.
Your
we
500
need several
cups.
hundred cups of tea to develop the relationship. And it's not only in the First Nations side, that this consultation. When we talk to most proponents, we focus on the desire or the need for social acceptance.
Right.
You've got to get out there and communicate, be transparent, because, if not, things go south pretty fast.
And so critical, important. And what I've seen transpire over the last 10 years is that the evolution on both sides. And we were talking earlier about the Mactaquac Dam, and I worked for WNNB, the Wolastoqey Nation in New Brunswick, on a labor market study for what it would take to refurbish. And it was a dire question, an urgent question back in 2017. Here we are 2025 and nothing has been done. So the idea of being able to rely on that relationship, going both ways. What are the expectations? What is the worldview? And that's what proponents have to come and sit and and spend time. And they're on a different clock.
And I would almost bring it even to another level of government. When you have a provincial government or a federal government that, that's why, we're coming up to a federal election. So I just wanted to touch on the point how important it is to vote.
Yeah.
Because you look at the platform of what the party represents. And is it progressive? Is it something that's going to move us further ahead, not bring us back? We want to be continually moving ahead. And if you have a platform that doesn't address the issues that have to be addressed, then really is it a good platform? That's what it comes down to. I think.
Sorry, bro, but I think leadership's important too. I mean, if you look at who do you want to lead in moving forward, you put partisan politics aside and you look for that person, that individual, that leader that's best suited to deal us through, this turmoil that we've got now. So from my point of view, I agree. Voting is very important. Get out there and vote and express your opinion and look at that leadership possibility and moving forward and what that particular leader's trait has with respect to leading you through that turmoil that you're moving forward. I mean, we're in a situation where, we're talking energy, and that's self-sufficiency. We're moving there. And not only that, but to be able to generate an economy, we need power, we need energy, and we need the leadership to show us to move in that direction.
And, we're seeing that evident just in the last couple of days with the agreement between New Brunswick and Ontario. An agreement that had never been thought of before.
Interprovincial trade.
Interprovincial trade. Well, I think hopefully that at some point in the near future that we're going to be able to say, well, thank you, U.S., for really bonding us together here in Canada and creating opportunities that were overlooked because we were reliant on other systems and other structures. And I think we've got a great spot here.
Viewers out there, we want to be able to go across the river in Quebec and come back with a couple of cases of beer without having to worry about taxes, right?
But it's interesting because we are looking at that. I mean, if you look at what's we recently signed an agreement with the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia, the Mi'kmaq of New Brunswick, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia for a transmission line from down in Dieppe, I think it is, or Salisbury up to the across the Nova Scotia border. So these kind of things, instead of looking north-south, we have to look east-west.
And it's collaborative leadership, right? What's in it for everybody.
But I just, first of all, Jim, you introduced me to Tom, and I really want to thank you for that. We really struck a great friendship in our work. Working with you guys has just been a pleasure. But you're quite right, and coming from the energy field, coming from my background, I've learned so much since I've been with you three, actually, in the fact that, and it's more than just a legal requirement. It has to be something that's from the heart, right? It has to be something that's really, really, and and we see it when we do work with you guys and some of the companies you work for. You can tell sometimes it's legalistic, but sometimes it's really from the heart, and you guys pick that up very easily, I find.
And what we try to do with proponents, again, it gives them an understanding that on the path towards reconciliation is just not moving forward. It's an understanding, knowing what happened in the past, what I call indigenization, and then the next step is moving towards reconciliation. And it's all about working collaboratively. We want to be part of the success.
Yeah, I think getting out of that myopic look, right, of saying it's a First Nation thing and we're doing it. It's us and them mentality. We got to get away from that nowadays. I mean, because we all have to be. These are trying times. Yeah, and that's challenging.
And that's one of the things, Jim, that I've noticed is that how we've evolved. Yeah. And I say we, the collective we. Yeah. And here, the fact of the matter is the Bay of Chaleur region, in my view, is a model. Is a model in the making in terms of an excellence center in how things get done. I was pointing out to Norm just the flag that with the village of Nigadoo. I mean, that's what, 5 years ago now. Each step is so important. It's like vernishing a floor, refinishing a floor. It's layer by layer by layer.
It's been a hard work and a commitment. For example, Terry here, in building a relationship with the Acadian Peninsula, in French, going down there, working with them, working with the flags for Nigadoo as well. I mean, it's all part of being together, and uniting for a common cause, moving forward.
And to that point, and I hope this is only the first step, but for, again, New Brunswick and Ontario signing, and Nova Scotia signing that deal.
As well.
From an energy perspective, I don't know if a lot of people recognize that, but the energy network that we put together here over the last 50 or 100 years is north-south. It's not east-west.
Yeah.
100% right.
So now it's time to start thinking east-west, right? And I think that, the energy corridor they're talking about and stuff like that, finally, it seems like, as you mentioned, somebody else pushed us there, but we might thank them in the end, right?
No, you're 100% right. And the one thing I would stress on it's not self-serving for us when we look at working with the communities here. It's about doing the right thing. And for us, if you ever want to tell, I always tell our Acadian friends, your culture and your language make your identity as a people. When you lose your culture and you lose your language, you lose your identity. Ask a First Nations person. We've all been there. So it's important that they keep that. So that's why I think our tie with the Francophone community is very important, because they're at that crossroads. If they lose their language, they lose their culture, they lose their identity. So we want to see them protected. I'd like to see us be a trilingual province at some point. Obviously, English, French, and Mi'kmaq, but hopefully we'll get there. But this is a goal you strive to achieve. So I think that working together brings so much strength in the region, and especially on the energy sector, which we're looking at now with the Northern Energy Group that we're working with.
Yeah, no, it's amazing, and that idea of working together. There's so much history in this province, and good history, and that we tend to focus on the bad history.
Keep that train of thought.
Okay.
We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Mawio'mi Gathering Place. So, where we left off, we were into the energy debate talk here earlier. And one of the things I wanted to mention, gentlemen, is the fact that, how do we approach this? Do we do it individually as a province? Do we do it as a multitude of provinces? What would be a best solution, Norm, do you think, to address the energy crisis?
Well, if I was king for a day,
well, let's make it king.
Okay.
my perception is, I think it's time for the Atlantic provinces or Maritime provinces to think about one large grid. And because it's getting more and more expensive to run these things separately in between. So therefore, then it's the question, well, who would run it? But those are questions we can answer later. But my perception was, and it wasn't necessarily against the Atlantic Loop concept. It might have extended a little too far, but at the end of the day, if we can all produce power at a certain level and pitch it in and at the lowest cost, right? So there'll be some sort of, sometimes people competing against one another is good for everybody. I think it's time to start thinking that way. We just can't keep thinking about, hey, it's in our little world. The world is bigger now, right? And that's fundamentally a big difference.
Wouldn't it be a little more complex, Norm, bringing Newfoundland and Labrador into that loop?
Well, we already have the timeline between Newfoundland and Nova Scotia.
Okay.
So that it's already there. Now you might have to finish the other side. You want to make it like a circle, so it's interdependent on each other. But I just think there's a solution there, and I think it would solve a lot of provinces' problems. More than one, it would solve a lot of them.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, Norm. I always said, that the Atlantic approach, and when I go to a lot of these symposiums and talks, that is, I think, the stronger approach.
Yeah.
And then you're not bearing all the cost. You're looking at it as a more holistic approach of 4 provinces addressing the whole Atlantic region. I love that idea.
Yeah, and when you think about it, New Brunswick has what, 800, 900,000 people?
How many does Toronto have?
Yeah, it's the size of, it's not even a big city. So, I mean, we're trying to compete against everybody else. It's time to think a little bit differently. I know we want to be a little bit protective. I understand that piece. But at one point, the cost of that is so high that you need to start thinking other ways, right?
So you've been dealing with a lot of proponents too, Tom, when they come in. I mentioned some names out there, especially in the wind sector, solar sector, battery storage sector. Do you find that there's a real interest, but cost-wise, if the incentives weren't there to offset the cost, do you think those projects would be able to come to fruition?
Well, I think some of them can. It can very well. They come because they've proven themselves. The wind turbine project on the Gaspé, for example. They had major players. They have a great equity business model, 51-49, with the First Nations having the 51%. And there's got to be government support at points if the government is really committed to the development of the region and development of the sector. And we see that there are programs that are available, but there's some industry, some sectors that are going to depend more heavily on government funding than others.
I think there's more like tax incentives for the government. I think if you're looking at from a budgetary expenditure side of things, it's kind of difficult for the province. But as a deputy minister, you know, there's the administrative aspect that can facilitate things, right? Permitting, you know, all of this sort of stuff can, you know, streamline it.
Yeah, and that goes to the point that Norm brought up earlier about, you know, having across the Atlantic provinces. And we all have different assets. We all have different ways of being able to contribute. Here, our geographical location, for example, was incredibly important to Hydro-Quebec in 2010. You know, we have transmission lines accessing the U.S. But you know, there are other advantages that the teams can be built around to bring it together. So in terms of funding, there's a hybrid of opportunities for how the government can contribute. Governments at 3 levels can contribute to the development of the economic development picture.
Tom, getting into your area of an expertise as a negotiator, former labor union individual, et cetera. I mean, you know, one of the things that we've had discussions with proponents coming in, they're looking at the big picture. They're looking and saying, okay, do you have training? Do you have housing? Do you have workers? What are the status of unions and that sort of stuff? Perhaps you gentlemen could comment a little bit about that as being part of the overall picture to attract proponents.
Yeah,
Go ahead first.
yeah. I'd say, you know, here in New Brunswick, we always focus on the fact that we don't have people for work. And you know, I think there's a lot of work that can be done, a lot more work can be done going into the schools and identifying what is available for kids. You know, whether it's, you think of if we need tradespeople, you can't talk to people in grade 12 about tradespeople or the trades because it'll take them 5 years to get there. You start talking grade 7 and grade 8 and having programs. And I think it's a collaborative exercise among many departments within government. I was never concerned about the funding because, you know, there's federal funding that provides for labor training and availability, and it becomes a priority. Why is there a shortage of nurses? Why is there a shortage of healthcare workers? Why is there a shortage of tradespeople? You know, we have a housing crisis right now. I heard the other day that we need 35,000 new tradespeople in Canada. And you think, well, how are we going to start doing that? Well, number one, I always believe that, you know, if you want to sit under a tree in the shade in July, there's 2 best years to plant the tree. One is 35 years ago. The next best year is this year.
Yeah.
So you know,
Well
when you talk about the development of a team approach, it's getting everyone to the table, and that's where you go back to. It's not consultation; it's relationship building. It's engagement. It's sharing worldviews. It's identifying expectations across the table and say, let's make a plan because we're all in this together. You know, that's the piece, and you know, I think there's great opportunity going back to funding and labor market development. You know, it's not about build it and they will come. That's a piece of it, but we have to be building here in New Brunswick at the grassroots level.
You know, in the good old days, I was the CEO of a startup nuclear company. And I traveled the country here talking about, you know, small modular reactors across the country. And I don't know how many Maritimers that are planted everywhere across this country will come to me, please succeed because I want to go home.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of that. And I think that, you know, and one thing about Maritimers and New Brunswickers, they love to work, you know, and if you give them a good job and a good pay, make it safe that they get home to their families, they will come and they will work. So you're quite right. You have to set that up, and to his point, you have to set up the whole process before you get there. But we need a secure energy supply to bring these companies here, right? There's no data bank who's going to come here with an unreliable grid because they need power like you wouldn't believe.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I'm working on some projects in Alberta,
300-400 megawatts.
and you know, having a conversation with Minister Jean, the Minister of Energy there, and you know, he wants to build 45 of these things.
45.
Right? 45 data centers.
Wow.
And every one of them will have 3 or 4 gas turbines attached to the end of it to produce power. Well, if we could get 5 of those, right, down here. We don't have gas, but let's use something else, right? And if we had a grid that's across the Maritimes, everybody would be providing power accordingly. And so the whole setup, I think, as you mentioned, we keep thinking about New Brunswick, and we have to think about New Brunswick, but you have to get a little bit picture. And I think that's what might be missing in the whole concept. Right now.
You talked about evolution a little bit, Tom, and from one time I remember when way back, jobs, they would come into a proponent would come into First Nations and they say, we're going to give you some jobs.
Right.
The benefit's going to be some contracting.
Trinkets.
As my brother says, trinkets.
Yep.
But we've evolved as well.
Right.
Now we're looking at equity stakes.
Yep.
You're here for the long run. Well, what's the benefit to the First Nation on the equity side? So that's almost an evolution that's happened as well. And in your gentleman's opinion, when you're dealing with proponents, how do they feel about that now? Do you find that there's a pushback on that? Or are they just say that's the norm that's happening across Canada?
No, I if I can, Norm,
Go ahead.
the norm across Canada.
There's the norm normalized.
From my perspective is that it's changing quickly, but it's changing quickly in relation to how slow it was before. And there are proponents that are coming in and they get it. They get it 100%. I mean, I know we can share this. We're dealing with Intergex. Intergex gets it. Yeah. And there's certain sectors, within the energy sector that get it, have gotten it quicker. The renewables are a lot quicker in getting this. And certainly what's happening now is that there's been the table's been set around around the Bay of Chaleur, saying if you want to have a successful project, a successful business, you need to be ready to partner. Number two, within that partnership, there has to be that equity piece up front. Because I remember Terry with 10 years ago, we talk about, and there's going to be 30 jobs. There's never 30 jobs. No. You know that, and Jim, you're being very kind calling them trinkets. They weren't even trinkets. Yeah. The fact of the matter is now and that's being driven by your leadership. That's being driven by the understanding of self-determination and self-government. Like that's part of the evolution as well.
But just look at the work that Tom and I did for you guys when we talked about the swim lanes. Remember the 3 swim lanes? And that was a concept that came out of British Columbia, right? That's where we went and got it. And it's important. I think companies are starting to recognize that some of those swim lanes, that's the past. There's new swim lanes now for groups like very visionary people like you two have been in the energy file. So it's important. I think it's a learning for everybody, and I think it's going to take time. Is it perfect? No, but I think it's getting better. Yeah.
I almost like that energy concept of sharing with municipalities too. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, this new, sort of what they've done in the Gaspé, mind you, it's huge there. I think there's like 50 communities. With one windmill, one windmill project, that's a lot of sharing. But I mean, if you've got like a group that's together, municipalities now are looking at that. Yeah. Because they realize that your tax base doesn't cut it alone anymore. No. You look at we had Norm Pelche from Heron Bay on the other day on one of our episodes, and they're challenged. There's nothing happening up there. It's an older population, hard to keep your infrastructure running, to keep your town employees employed, because you just don't have that tax base. So I think these kind of projects are going to pick up a lot more, where those partnerships, not only with First Nations, but with municipalities too. So it's a multitude of looking around and saying this is going to be beneficial for everybody.
And you know what one of the sad pieces of this is, and I lived it myself, is that your kids move away to wherever the jobs are. Yeah. And one of mine just came back. The other one, as you know, he's in America. He's in the U.S. now. He's
we won't hold it against
hockey player, whatever. But how proud I was to see him back. And my wife was stunned. And I said, it was a missing part of us. In those places, as you mentioned, Huron Bay is an example. There's a lot of kids that moved away. Boys, if you provide them work, they'll come back. And that would be a success story in my mind.
I agree 100%. Yeah. 100%.
Yeah, and Norm talked about that too, and we're seeing it as well in our community, where people who've prospered, let's say, for example, out of the province, are now coming back. Whether it's to our community, we're seeing a lot of people wanting to come back into our community. Norm talked about that yesterday, about Norm Pelche, the mayor, talked about, people coming back into Dalhousie. Now, having said that, a lot of them are retire,
Yeah.
you know, and so that, you know, how does that help your younger folks, you know, in terms of generating an economy? But, you know, out of sometime despair comes creativity. Norm talked about the pipeline, for example, water pipeline. Going from, you know, the dam down into the mill, and how now the water just went into the bay, and now they got a little turbine generator generating power there, and he's talking about the dam. So, you know, sometimes you just put your creative hat on and away you go. Like one of the things that we do is I always taught we try to tap into what I call intellectual capital. That's people who have, you know, experience, have know-how, who have a bit of wisdom and have mentorship and all of that, have contacts. And so we can pick up the phone and call them, and that generates ideas. So you don't necessarily have to be confined to your small little locale, you know.
Yeah, that piece about critical thinking, like what is the alternative? What is the alternative to this situation, whatever that situation is, and how do we say, and yeah, there's a lot of opinions. There's a Datsun dealer here in Bathurst that used to say, Datsuns are like, opinions are like,
Yeah, everyone's
got one. But the fact of the matter is there's great opinions out there. And it goes back to what we were saying earlier about having individuals around a table.
Gentlemen, can we hold on to that opinion?
Yeah.
We'll be right back.
Welcome back to our next segment and final segment of Mawio'mi Gathering Place. So, gentlemen, it's been a real interesting passage of time
As in
here.
ever, we've covered a spectrum here.
But I have something that I'd like to just ask about, and I think it's in regards to new technology. What do you guys see out there that you're saying, you know, the light bulb's coming on, and you're saying, wow, that's something interesting. Just curious, Norm.
Well, let's go really out there. So as I mentioned.
Well, Norm, it's not what is, it's what can be.
Yeah, there you go. As you know, I was appointed to the National Research Council, so I get to look at the future.
Kudos to you on that.
Yes, congratulations.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be chosen and to serve the public of Canada. Fusion is something that there's a lot of work happening, and in fact, in BC, British Columbia. There's lots of work going on there. That'll be interesting because I think that if we can get to a point that we can get fusion operating, which is, you know, some years away, that would be a tremendous benefit to mankind, I think.
Wow. How far away do you think that is?
Well, people ask me, but I mean, not as a council member, but as just a nuclear guy, I would say we're at least 25 years out, I think, on that one. But the thing is as we're building, if we continue to build new nuclear, you know, what's the window where this will start to take over, or will start to impact on decision in nuclear because, but fusion is going to only 10 years away, right? So, because remember, once you decide to build nuclear, it's 10 years, right? It's a decade. Yeah.
I know where Terry's going too with that, not to eliminate the nuclear side, but Prodigy.
Oh, yes.
The comment on there, you know, that platform that they got, to take it up into isolated areas where you know, mining companies or communities are dependent on diesel, and that platform houses you know, an SMNR.
Yeah.
That's a future, really.
That's innovation at work, right there. That is excellent. I think that company is going to make some real advancements, I believe, going forward. And obviously, they're the smaller nuclear units, right? They're not the big ones. They're real small. But yeah, to get something up north, as long as society accepts it up there, there's a social acceptance to having it there. I think it's a real advantage.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, Norm, because we're dealing with Prodigy, and we've been talking with Prodigy and with the leaders up in the Inuit up north, and we're trying to get them to come down and visit Point Lepreau as a first step, getting that process going. But the thing that always scares me about New Brunswick, and I say this in a loving manner, is we have a tendency not to embrace innovation.
You're really loving, bro. You're embracing now, too.
But not embracing innovation. And it's unfortunate because we miss out. And I look at this kind of technology, they've come to New Brunswick.
Grab it, run
We
with
want
it.
to do our supply chain aspect here in Beldoon, at the Port of Beldoon. We see this as an opportunity. Here's the technology. It's only being done by the by the Russians and the Chinese right now. That type of platform, putting a small nuclear reactor on it and bringing it up north and putting it into a harbor to operate to provide secure energy and the mining sector of critical minerals up north. So this technology is there, But are we going to just sit by and say, well, you know, hi, it looks good. It's not, well, you know, it's not shale gas and it's not fracking, so we're not going to take it.
Well, you know what I'm hoping for on that, Chief, is the fact that from a societal perspective, that we're seeing right now, we're up against a whole lot of very, very challenging things, and being able to move beyond them, there's going to be good things to be able to be seen that we're going to be able to build upon. And you know, we didn't realize that we have to really have secure doors between passengers and the cockpit until 9/11.
True.
You know, we don't see well into the future, but I think we can follow the trends and be able to say, hey, we can follow those trends. And I think leadership here and around the Bay of Chaleur will prove well for not only New Brunswick, but we're talking about the Atlantic region and across the country, is that being able to show people that there is something that we can't predict the future, but we can follow the dots, connect the dots and follow the trend. And have the people who got skin in the game around the table and have them at the table to say, let's make a plan going forward. And that's the way you're able to address. So, you know, the example, you know, the Prodigy example is a prime one. You know, there it is out there. It's being tested, tried, and in other jurisdictions. Hey, you know, what's the alternative to that? Well, maybe there's no alternative to that. How do we make our path lead up to that? And that takes planning, and that takes leadership, and it takes you know, my last point is that we are all in this, you know, and why can't we all contribute to it?
Yeah.
So a couple of tests on the Prodigy thing would be the first thing people should recognize: it's not nuclear. This is a host nuclear site.
Exactly.
It's not nuclear.
Not the same.
So it's not. It's basically a marine vessel.
Yeah.
Well, no, it's a platform.
Well, platform, whatever you want to call it, but it's marine.
But
Yeah.
you need the water.
Yeah, you need the water.
Yeah, there you go. So I think that should give some, you know, so therefore the supply chain you're talking about is here would be fantastic, because it's really that sort of work that's going on, you know. Right. Heavy metals, weldings, I mean, this is just fantastic for the region if we can get yeah. The second piece is my test for this stuff, after again looking at what I've done is where's private investment? If we continue to rely on government for some of these projects, they struggle to get forward, right? We, you know, you go back to, I remember reading a story of the gentleman that tried to build cars here. Bricklin.
Oh,
if you read his book,
yeah.
right, which was really interesting, one of the pieces of advice he gives is this: if you're trying to build a business and all you got is government money, you're not going to be successful. So that's the test case right there. When does the private investment come in?
And I think,
sorry, go ahead.
And the opportunity is there, I think, for private investment. When you look at mining companies, right? Yeah. They need energy.
Yeah.
And the cost that they're paying for diesel fuel is astronomical. Mm-hmm. So is it worthwhile for a mine life of 20 years, 25 years? You've got uranium mines, you've got critical mineral, lithium mines in that region. Yeah. So that would be part of the solution. And the social acceptance would be the First Nation having ownership of the power plant, selling the power through whatever partnership they have to the mining company, and at the same time to their own members. Yeah. And it's paying itself off, and it's creating wealth.
But we're very conservative. I mean, you look at venture capital, how venture capital functions in the States. I mean, venture capital is that risky kind of capital, but risky, no risk. I mean, you know, in terms of venture capitalists down in the States, it seems that they can get the deal through pretty fast. In our particular case, we have venture capital, but we seem to be more conservative about our venture capital. You know, maybe that'll change out of necessity. You know, in projects like that, you know, that seem to be something you got to take a risk, but you know, out of necessity, we need the solution, and so perhaps people will move more into that direction.
When you talk about innovation, Tom, and we were talking, that was one example in the nuclear when Norm was talking about vision. What about, you know, battery storage? And do you see some innovation being done there in that area with renewables?
Well, certainly. You know, we have a great example that of a company that's very interested in establishing here, and just my experience with them over the last 4 years is that they've seen incredible technological advancements that are causing their costing to go down, to be reduced. So, you know, the advancement and the interest that they have, and to a point that was raised earlier, in terms of across the sector, there are proponents that A, come with money, B, come with a more collaborative view, and C, want to be successful. and they're tapping into the communities, and that is an incredible piece that I've witnessed in the last just 5-6 years, and that's going to continue. We're going to hit our bumps. We're going to hit individuals. We're going to hit projects that we just don't get it, and honestly, I think that domestic companies are slower to the game because they're in the history, right? And I find the global-based companies are coming in with a much different perspective of how to do business in a new country. And it's not about analyzing the history. It's about saying, okay, that's the history. How do we move forward? And we're seeing that from a number. There's a whitefish hatchery, the largest in Europe.
Yeah.
Are coming in here, and they see the natural resources, saying, hey, we want to do business here. What does it take to do business here? And you say it takes this, this, and this. And they're saying, we're in.
Gentlemen, 20 seconds each. Final comments.
Or you go first.
Well, I just want to say this very, very quickly. When I was first asked by a retired chief, where are your people from? And I said, well, in 1837, they sailed up the Miramichi River. And before I could say another word, that chief went, and my people were here to embrace them.
Absolutely.
In my case, listen, first I just want to thank you three. I mean, the work we've done up here has just been fantastic. And, I'm a New Brunswicker at heart, and I really hope that we can address this energy problem because I just don't know where it's going, and I'm really concerned. But I know that if we if we go out and ask the people, they'll give NB Power direction, and the government in particular, and come up with a good solution. I know there is one there, that's for sure.
Bro, this has been great.
It's been great having you guys, gentlemen. Thank you for coming, and it's been a great. And we look forward to a lot more collaboration and a lot more cups of tea. That's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely, and we value your friendship and your knowledge and wisdom as well.